Maria Santos had always been careful about the clothes she wore to work. As a government translator in the small border town of San Miguel, she understood that appearances mattered. Her crisp white blouses and dark skirts spoke of professionalism and respect for her position. But, on that humid Tuesday morning in March, she had no idea that her choice of a simple gold pendant would change everything. The pendant had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had weathered storms that would have broken lesser souls. It was small, no bigger than a coin, with intricate symbols carved into its surface. Maria had worn it every day for 15 years, tucked safely beneath her clothing, close to her heart where it brought her comfort during difficult translations and tense meetings. The morning started like any other. Maria arrived at the government building at exactly 7:30, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she made her way to the 3rd floor. The security guards nodded their usual greeting, and she smiled back, adjusting her identification badge as she walked. The pendant shifted slightly against her chest, a familiar weight that reminded her of her grandmother's words about strength coming from unexpected places. Colonel Rodriguez was waiting in her office when she arrived. This was unusual. The man rarely spoke to anyone below his rank, and Maria was just a civilian employee. He stood by her window, looking out at the street below, his uniform pressed to perfection and his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Santos," he said without turning around. "We need to discuss your security clearance." Maria felt her stomach tighten. She had held her clearance for over a decade without incident. Her record was spotless, her translations accurate, and her loyalty to her country unquestioned. She set her purse down carefully and smoothed her skirt before responding. "Is there a problem, Colonel?" He turned then, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that made her skin crawl. "There have been questions raised about your associations. Your family background. We need to conduct a thorough review." The words hit her like a physical blow. Maria's family had lived in San Miguel for generations. They were shopkeepers, teachers, and civil servants. Her father had served in the military with distinction, and her mother taught at the local school. What associations could possibly be in question? "I don't understand," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her throat. "You will. Report to room 101 in the basement immediately. Bring nothing with you." The basement of the government building was a place Maria had never been. Few people had reason to go there, and those who did rarely spoke of what they found. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. Room 101 was at the end of a long corridor, its heavy door marked only with numbers. Inside, 3 men in civilian clothes waited. They didn't introduce themselves, but their badges identified them as internal security investigators. The room was bare except for a metal table and 2 chairs. No windows, no decorations, just cold efficiency. "Sit," one of them commanded. Maria had translated interrogation transcripts before. She knew the techniques, the pressure points, the way fear could be cultivated and harvested. But knowing about something in theory was very different from experiencing it firsthand. "Your grandmother, Elena Santos, was she born in this country?" The question came from the man with the scar on his chin. "Yes, of course. My family has been here for generations." "Your grandfather, Miguel Santos, what was his occupation?" "He was a blacksmith. He made horseshoes and tools for the farmers." The questions continued for an hour, each one seemingly innocent but building towards something Maria couldn't see. They asked about relatives she barely remembered, about trips to neighboring countries, about books her family had owned, about conversations overheard at family gatherings. Then, the man with the scar leaned forward. "We're going to need you to remove your jewelry." "I'm sorry?" "All jewelry. Earrings, rings, necklaces. Everything." Maria's hand instinctively went to her throat, where the chain of her grandmother's pendant lay hidden beneath her blouse. "This is highly irregular. I demand to know what this is about." "You're not in a position to make demands, Miss Santos." The room seemed to grow smaller. Maria could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. She removed her small earrings first, then her watch. Her hands shook slightly as she placed them on the metal table. "The necklace," the man said. "I'm not wearing a necklace." It was a lie, and they all knew it. The chain was visible at the base of her throat, just above the collar of her blouse. One of the other men stepped forward, and Maria realized with growing horror that they intended to search her if she didn't comply. With trembling fingers, she reached for the clasp at the back of her neck. The pendant had been her secret strength for so long, her connection to the women who had come before her. As she lifted it over her head and placed it on the table, she felt something inside her break. The effect was immediate. All three men leaned forward, staring at the small gold disc as if it were radioactive. The man with the scar picked it up with a handkerchief, holding it up to the light. "Where did you get this?" "It was my grandmother's." "Do you know what these symbols mean?" Maria looked at the pendant, really looked at it, perhaps for the first time in years. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to dance in the harsh fluorescent light. They were beautiful, intricate, but she had never given them much thought. To her, they were just decorations, part of the pendant's charm. "They're just designs. Family markings, maybe." The three men exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a communication Maria couldn't interpret. The man with the scar carefully wrapped the pendant in the handkerchief and placed it in a small evidence bag. "Miss Santos, this interview is concluded. You are suspended from your position pending further investigation. You will not discuss this meeting with anyone. You will not leave the city without permission. Do you understand?" The words seemed to come from very far away. Maria nodded, though she understood nothing. How had her grandmother's pendant become evidence of something? Evidence of what? She was escorted back to her office to collect her personal belongings under supervision. Her colleagues watched from their doorways, whispering among themselves. By the time she reached her desk, everyone in the building would know that Maria Santos was under investigation. Her hands moved automatically, gathering her coffee mug, her family photos, the small cactus that had somehow survived on her windowsill for 3 years. But her mind was reeling. The pendant was gone, taken as evidence of crimes she didn't understand. The connection to her grandmother, to her family's history, had been severed with the efficiency of a surgical blade. As she walked out of the government building that day, carrying a small box of her belongings, Maria caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The pendant's absence was a weight all its own, a hollow space where certainty used to live. Behind her, in room 101, 3 men were already making phone calls. The pendant was being photographed, documented, prepared for analysis. What they had found would send shock waves through the highest levels of government, but Maria Santos, the woman who had worn it unknowingly for 15 years, was the last person who would learn the truth. That evening, alone in her small apartment, Maria sat at her kitchen table and tried to remember everything her grandmother had ever told her about the pendant. The memories came in fragments: Elena's hands fastening the chain around a young Maria's neck, whispers about keeping family close to the heart, warnings about the importance of discretion. For the first time, Maria wondered if her grandmother's stories about their family's strength had been more than just stories. As night fell over San Miguel, she began to understand that her life as she knew it was over, and, somewhere in the darkness, people were already deciding her fate based on symbols she had never bothered to understand. 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality. Maria found herself trapped in her own life, unable to work, unable to leave the city, unable to understand what was happening to her. The phone calls from concerned colleagues had stopped after the first day. Word traveled fast in a small town, and being under government investigation was like having a contagious disease. She spent the morning of the 4th day cleaning her apartment with obsessive thoroughness, as if organizing her spice rack and scrubbing her bathroom tiles could somehow restore order to her world. When the knock came at her door, she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing grout that was already spotless. Through the peephole, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a dark coat despite the warm weather. There was something familiar about her face, though Maria was certain they had never met. "Miss Santos?" My name is Carmen Delgado. I knew your grandmother. The words made Maria's hand freeze on the door handle. Elena Santos had been dead for 8 years. Her circle of friends had largely passed away before her, and Maria thought she had met everyone who had been important in her grandmother's life. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain engaged. I'm sorry, but I don't know you. You wouldn't. Elena was very careful about who she introduced to family. The woman's voice carried the same cadence as Maria's grandmother, the same measured way of speaking that suggested every word was chosen with purpose. But, given what has happened to you, I think she would want me to break that tradition. Maria studied the woman's face more carefully. There was indeed something familiar there, something around the eyes that reminded her of her grandmother. Against her better judgment, she removed the security chain and opened the door. Carmen Delgado stepped into the apartment with the confidence of someone who had navigated dangerous situations before. She moved to the window and glanced down at the street before turning back to Maria. They're watching your building, she said matter-of-factly. They have been since Tuesday. Who's watching? What is this about? Carmen settled into Maria's kitchen chair as if she belonged there. Your grandmother never told you about the resistance, did she? The word hit Maria like a physical blow. What resistance? The one your grandfather helped lead 40 years ago. The one your grandmother supported until the day she died. The one that pendant you've been wearing represents. Maria sank into the opposite chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. That's impossible. My grandparents were simple people. They owned a small shop, they went to church, they raised their children quietly. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Including you, apparently. Carmen reached into her coat and pulled out a small photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of young people gathered around what looked like radio equipment. Maria recognized her grandfather immediately, though he was much younger than she had ever known him to be. Miguel Santos was one of the key organizers of the underground network that passed information to rebel forces during the civil conflict. Your grandmother Elena was a courier. She carried messages and supplies hidden in her market baskets and sewing supplies. Carmen pointed to a young woman in the photograph. Even at 18, Elena's eyes held the same determined strength that Maria remembered. The pendant was their symbol. Each member of their cell carried one. The symbols you thought were decorative? They're a code. A very sophisticated one that identified safe houses, escape routes, and contact protocols. Maria stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the smiling young woman with the grandmother who had braided her hair and taught her to make tamales. But the war ended decades ago. Why would anyone care now? Carmen's expression grew grave. Because some wars never really end, child. They just go underground. She pulled out another photograph, this one more recent. It showed a man in military uniform cutting a ribbon at what appeared to be an official ceremony. Maria recognized him immediately as General Francisco Morales, the current Minister of Defense. Morales was a lieutenant during the conflict. He was responsible for hunting down members of the resistance. Your grandparents' network cost him a promotion and nearly ended his career when they helped 300 families escape his military operation. He's been looking for the surviving members of that network for 40 years. When you wore that pendant to a government building, to your job translating sensitive documents, you lit up like a beacon on his radar. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, each revelation more terrifying than the last. But I didn't know any of this. I never helped anyone escape. I don't even know what the resistance was fighting for. It doesn't matter what you knew or didn't know. What matters is what you represent. You're the granddaughter of Miguel and Elena Santos, and you've been working in a position where you had access to classified information. In Morales' mind, you're either a sleeper agent or a security risk. Carmen leaned forward, her voice becoming urgent. There's something else you need to understand. Your grandmother didn't just pass down the pendant to you randomly. She chose you specifically. What do you mean? Elena had 3 granddaughters. You were the youngest, the one she thought was least likely to be suspected. She trained you for this without you even knowing it. Maria thought back to her childhood, to the hours spent with her grandmother. Elena had taught her to observe details, to remember faces and conversations, to notice when people were lying or afraid. She had encouraged Maria to learn languages, to develop skills that would make her valuable to the government. At the time, it had seemed like the natural guidance of a loving grandmother. She was preparing you to be a bridge between the old resistance and the new generation. The pendant wasn't just a family heirloom. It was your credentials. Credentials for what? The network never died, Maria. It evolved. The people your grandparents helped save went on to become doctors, teachers, business owners, politicians. Their children and grandchildren are now in positions of influence throughout the region. Elena was the keeper of their stories, their guardian. She was supposed to pass that responsibility to you when you were ready. But she died before she could tell me any of this. She died because Morales was getting close to identifying her. The heart attack wasn't natural, child. Elena knew they were closing in, and she knew she had to protect the network. She took its secrets with her to the grave. The words seemed to echo in the small kitchen. Maria felt as if the floor was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about herself, was being rewritten. So what happens now? Carmen stood and moved back to the window. Now you have a choice to make. You can turn yourself in, cooperate with Morales' investigation, and hope they believe you when you say you know nothing. Or you can honor your grandmother's legacy and help us protect the people she died to keep safe. What people? The families who are still here, still vulnerable. Morales isn't just hunting the old resistance. He's preparing to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to his political ambitions. He wants to be president, and he can't have witnesses to his war crimes walking around freely. Carmen pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket and placed it on the table. There's an address written there. If you decide you want to learn the truth about your family, about what your grandmother really died protecting, be there tomorrow at midnight. And if I don't come? Then, you're on your own with Morales and his investigators. But, I should warn you, they're not going to be satisfied with just taking your pendant. They're going to want to know everything your grandmother might have told you, everyone she might have introduced you to, every story she might have shared. Carmen moved toward the door, then paused. Your grandmother loved you very much, Maria. But, she also believed you were strong enough to carry on her work. She saw something in you that you haven't seen in yourself yet. After Carmen left, Maria sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the piece of paper. The address was in the old part of town, near the church where her grandparents had been married. She had walked past that building hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Outside her window, she could see the unmarked car Carmen had mentioned, parked across the street with two men inside. They weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. The message was clear: she was trapped, and they were watching her every move. As the sun set over San Miguel, Maria realized that her quiet life as a translator was over forever. The only question now was whether she would face her uncertain future alone, or whether she would finally step into the role her grandmother had been preparing her for all along. The pendant was gone, taken as evidence of crimes she was only beginning to understand. But, for the first time since that terrible morning in room 101, Maria felt something other than fear. Buried beneath the terror and confusion was a spark of something that might have been pride. Her grandmother hadn't been just a simple shopkeeper. She had been a warrior, fighting for something bigger than herself. Now it was Maria's turn to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Maria spent the day pacing her apartment, the piece of paper with the address burning like a coal in her pocket. Every time she looked out the window, the surveillance car was still there, its occupants taking turns sleeping and watching her building. They weren't even pretending to be subtle anymore. At 9 in the evening, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Colonel Rodriguez's number from the government building. Maria stared at it for 4 rings before answering. Miss Santos, you will report to headquarters tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest. The line went dead before she could respond. Maria set the phone down with shaking hands. Tomorrow at 8, or tonight at midnight. The choice was becoming clearer, and neither option offered any guarantee of safety. She made her decision at 11:30. The back exit of her building led to an alley that connected to the next street over. Maria had discovered this route years ago when she wanted to avoid a particularly persistent admirer. Tonight, it might save her life. She dressed in dark clothes and soft-soled shoes, carrying nothing but her identification and what little cash she had in the house. The pendant might be gone, but she still carried the skills her grandmother had taught her: how to move quietly, how to observe without being seen, how to disappear into a crowd. The alley was darker than she remembered. Maria pressed herself against the brick wall, listening for footsteps or voices that might indicate the surveillance team had anticipated this route. The only sounds were her own heartbeat and the distant hum of traffic from the main street. The address Carmen had given her led to a narrow building squeezed between a closed bakery and an electronics repair shop. The windows were dark, and there was no sign to indicate what the building might house. Maria checked her watch, 11:58. She knocked softly on the door, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones. The pattern felt familiar, though she couldn't remember where she might have learned it. The door opened immediately, and Carmen's face appeared in the gap. "I wasn't sure you would come." "I wasn't sure either." Maria followed Carmen through a narrow hallway and down a flight of stairs that seemed much longer than the building should have been able to accommodate. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged to a medieval castle rather than a modern building. Beyond the door was a room that took Maria's breath away. The space was larger than her entire apartment, carved directly into the rock beneath the city. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, maps, and photographs spanning decades. Computer equipment sat alongside manual typewriters, and radio equipment that looked both ancient and cutting-edge filled one entire corner. But it was the people that made Maria's heart race. 7 men and women, ranging in age from about 40 to 70, sat around a large wooden table. She recognized 2 of them immediately: Dr. Martinez, who had been her family physician for 15 years, and Mrs. Herrera, who ran the flower shop near her apartment. "Welcome to the real Santos family legacy," Carmen said, gesturing toward the table. Dr. Martinez stood first, his familiar smile carrying new meaning. "Your grandmother talked about you constantly, Maria. She was so proud of the woman you were becoming." "She was also terrified," added Mrs. Herrera. Elena knew Morales was getting closer to identifying the network. "She died protecting all of us, but she especially died protecting you." Carmen moved to one of the filing cabinets and withdrew a thick folder. "Before we go any further, you need to understand what your grandparents actually accomplished during the resistance." She opened the folder and spread dozens of photographs across the table. Maria saw her grandparents in image after image, always surrounded by people she didn't recognize. In some photos, they were distributing food and medical supplies. In others, they appeared to be coordinating with groups of armed men and women. The official history books say the civil conflict lasted 3 years and resulted in minimal civilian casualties, said Dr. Martinez. The truth is very different. He pulled out a map marked with red dots. Each of these marks represents a family that your grandparents' network helped escape from military operations. We're talking about over 1,500 people, Maria. Men, women, and children who would have died if not for the courage of Miguel and Elena Santos. But it wasn't just about evacuation, added a man Maria didn't recognize. Your grandfather was brilliant at disrupting communications. He would intercept military radio transmissions and warn civilian populations about planned raids. Carmen pointed to another section of photographs. Your grandmother developed an entire system of coded messages that could be embedded in seemingly innocent conversations. A discussion about the weather could warn of troop movements. A conversation about market prices could indicate safe times for travel. The pendant you've been wearing contains the master key to that entire coding system, Mrs. Herrera explained. The symbols aren't just decorative. They're a sophisticated cipher that your grandmother created to protect the network's communications. Maria stared at the photographs, beginning to understand the true scope of what her grandparents had accomplished. But, why is this still important? The war ended decades ago. The mood in the room shifted immediately. Carmen and Dr. Martinez exchanged glances before Carmen spoke. Because the people your grandparents saved didn't disappear, Maria. They integrated into society. They became teachers, doctors, business owners, government officials. Their children and grandchildren are now in positions of influence throughout the region. And General Morales, who is about to announce his candidacy for president, was the officer responsible for the military operations your grandparents disrupted, Dr. Martinez added. He's not just hunting the old resistance out of nostalgia, said the man Maria didn't recognize, introducing himself as Professor Valdez. He's eliminating witnesses to war crimes. If the truth about what happened during those 3 years ever came to light, it would destroy his political career and possibly land him in international court. Carmen spread out a new set of documents. In the past 5 years, 17 former resistance members have died under suspicious circumstances. Heart attacks, car accidents, sudden illnesses. Elena was just the most recent. The implications hit Maria like a truck. You're saying he's been systematically murdering people? We're saying the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental, Dr. Martinez replied. And, now that he's identified you as Elena's granddaughter, wearing the pendant that identifies you as a potential network member, you're in immediate danger. But, I don't know anything. I can't threaten him. You know more than you realize, Carmen said gently. Your grandmother told you stories throughout your childhood. Family stories, local history, details about people and places. Elena embedded crucial information in those stories, thinking she would have time to teach you how to decode them. Professor Valdez pulled out a notebook filled with what looked like genealogical charts. We've been trying to reconstruct the network's records since Elena died. But, we're missing crucial pieces. Names, locations, connections between families. Information that Elena kept in her memory and was planning to pass down to you. The pendant wasn't just a symbol, Maria. It was a key to accessing a network that still protects over 3,000 people spread across 6 countries, Mrs. Herrera explained. Which means, Carmen continued, that when Morales took that pendant, he didn't just take a piece of your family history. He took the key to identifying and eliminating every person your grandparents risked their lives to save. The weight of responsibility settled on Maria's shoulders like a heavy cloak. These people weren't just asking her to honor her grandmother's memory. They were asking her to help protect thousands of lives. What exactly are you asking me to do? Dr. Martinez leaned forward. We need you to help us recover the pendant and the information Morales has gathered about the network. But, more than that, we need you to access the memories your grandmother gave you. The stories she told, the lessons she taught, the details she shared about people and places. We think Elena encoded the network's current locations and identities in the stories she told you about your family history, Professor Valdez added. If we can decode those stories, we can warn people before Morales reaches them. Carmen placed a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. This is dangerous, child. If you help us, you'll be putting yourself at considerable risk. Morales has resources we can't match, and he's desperate enough to use them. But, if I don't help? Then, a lot of innocent people are going to die, and your grandmother's sacrifice will have been for nothing. Maria looked around the room at the faces watching her. These weren't international spies or professional revolutionaries. They were ordinary people who had been touched by her grandparents' courage and were now trying to honor that legacy. For the first time since this nightmare began, Maria understood what her grandmother had been preparing her for. Not just to carry a pendant or remember stories, but to make the same choice Elena and Miguel had made 40 years ago, to protect innocent people, regardless of the personal cost. Tell me what I need to do. The relief in the room was palpable. Carmen smiled, and, for a moment she looked so much like Elena that Maria's breath caught in her throat. First, we need to get you out of the city before tomorrow morning. Morales can't interrogate you if he can't find you. And, then? Then, we teach you how to be the woman your grandmother always knew you could be. By dawn, Maria was 60 miles away from San Miguel, hidden in a safe house that looked like an ordinary farmhouse but contained communication equipment that would have impressed a modern intelligence agency. Carmen had driven through the night using back roads that seemed to exist only in the memories of people who had needed to disappear quickly. The farmhouse belonged to Carlos Mendez, whose parents had been among the families Maria's grandparents had helped evacuate 40 years ago. Now a successful engineer, Carlos had spent the last 20 years quietly maintaining safe houses and communication networks for the descendants of the original resistance. "Your grandmother saved my family when I was 8 years old," he told Maria as she sipped coffee in his kitchen. "Government soldiers had surrounded our village. Elena and Miguel got us out through an old mining tunnel that ran under the church. We lived in the mountains for 6 months before it was safe to return." "I never knew any of this existed," Maria said, still struggling to process the scope of what her grandparents had built. "That was the point," Carmen replied, spreading maps across the kitchen table. "The network was designed to be invisible unless you needed it." She pointed to locations marked across the region. "There are 12 active safe houses, 17 contact points, and communication relays in 6 countries. All of it coordinated through information that your grandmother kept in her memory." "But Elena died before she could pass it all on," Carlos added grimly. "We've been operating blind for 8 years, unable to contact some cells, unsure which locations are still secure." Carmen pulled out a notebook filled with what looked like children's drawings. "We think Elena hid the current network information in the stories she told you. But we need to understand how her mind worked to decode them." She opened the notebook to reveal detailed sketches and notes in Elena's handwriting. "These are the stories your grandmother recorded in the year before she died. Stories about family picnics, village festivals, neighbors, and friends. They seem innocent enough, but we think they contain coordinates, contact protocols, and identity information for current network members." Maria studied the pages, recognizing her grandmother's careful handwriting. "She told me these stories dozens of times. I always thought she was just sharing family memories." She was, Dr. Martinez said, joining them at the table. But Elena was also one of the most sophisticated codemakers of her generation. She could embed multiple layers of information in a single conversation. He pointed to a story about a family picnic by a lake. "This story mentions specific numbers of sandwiches, the color of blankets, the time of day, and the weather. If we apply the coding system from the pendant, those details might translate to geographic coordinates." Carmen showed Maria a photograph of the pendant, now blown up to reveal the intricate detail of the symbols. Each symbol corresponds to a different type of information. Numbers, letters, locations, time periods. "Your grandmother taught you to recognize these patterns without realizing it." "What do you mean?" "Think about the games Elena played with you when you were small. The way she taught you to remember details, to notice patterns, to connect seemingly unrelated information." Maria closed her eyes, trying to recall those childhood afternoons. She remembered her grandmother pointing out details in photographs, asking her to remember the order of items on a table, teaching her to find patterns in the arrangement of flowers or the placement of furniture. "She was training your mind to work like hers," Carlos said gently. "Teaching you to see the hidden structure in ordinary things." Over the next several hours, Maria found herself immersed in a strange kind of archaeology, digging through her own memories to uncover secrets her grandmother had planted there. Story by story, they began to reconstruct pieces of the network Elena had carried in her head. The tale of cousin Roberto's wedding revealed coordinates for a safe house in the capital. A story about market day in the neighboring town contained contact protocols for reaching resistance families who had relocated to urban areas. Even the bedtime stories about mythical creatures contained real information about escape routes and emergency procedures. "Your mind is remarkable," Carmen said as Maria successfully decoded her 5th location in 2 hours. "Elena chose well." But, as they worked, Carlos monitored radio transmissions from San Miguel, and the news was increasingly troubling. When Maria failed to appear for her 8 o'clock appointment, Colonel Rodriguez had issued a warrant for her arrest. Government vehicles were conducting searches throughout the city, and roadblocks had been set up on all major routes. They're not just looking for you, Carlos reported grimly. They're conducting raids on addresses connected to people who knew your grandmother. The television in the corner showed footage of Mrs. Herrera being arrested at her flower shop. Dr. Martinez's medical clinic was surrounded by police vehicles. Professor Valdez had apparently disappeared, but his university office had been searched and sealed. They're rolling up the entire network, Carmen said, her face pale with worry. Morales isn't waiting to find you. He's moving against everyone he suspects might be connected to the resistance. Maria felt sick watching the news footage. These people were being arrested because they had tried to help her understand her family's legacy. This is my fault. If I hadn't gone to that meeting, this would have happened anyway, Carlos interrupted. Morales has been planning this for months. Your pendant just gave him the excuse to move. Carmen turned off the television and faced Maria directly. We have a choice to make. We can focus on keeping you safe and hope the arrests don't lead to anyone talking. Or we can use what you've helped us recover to warn the people who are still free. What's the difference? If we run, dozens of families in hiding will be discovered and eliminated because they won't know Morales has found them. If we fight back, we can save lives, but we'll be exposing ourselves to capture. Maria thought about Mrs. Herrera's kind smile, about Dr. Martinez treating her scraped knees when she was small, about Professor Valdez's obvious dedication to preserving history that powerful people wanted forgotten. What would my grandmother do? Elena would save as many people as possible, regardless of the personal cost, Carmen said without hesitation. Then, that's what we do. Carlos smiled for the first time since Maria had arrived. I was hoping you would say that. He led them to a room Maria hadn't seen before, filled with communication equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Multiple radio sets, satellite uplinks, encrypted telephone systems, and computer terminals created a maze of technology. This is the backup command center your grandmother helped design, Carlos explained. If the network ever came under coordinated attack, this facility was supposed to coordinate the response. Carmen began working at one of the computer terminals, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Using the information you've helped us decode, we can send warnings to at least 60% of the network. Safe houses can be abandoned, contact points can be changed, people can disappear before Morales reaches them. But, there's a catch, Carlos added. The moment we start transmitting, Morales will know exactly where we are. His people will triangulate our signal within hours. How long do we need? To warn everyone? At least 8 hours of continuous transmission. Maria understood immediately. They could save hundreds of lives, but it would almost certainly cost them their freedom, and possibly their lives. Morales would not be gentle with captured resistance members, especially ones who had just cost him years of careful planning. There's something else you need to know, Carmen said quietly. We've been monitoring Morales' communications. He's not just planning to eliminate the resistance. He's planning to use the crackdown as justification for declaring martial law. The arrests, the search operations, the discovery of terrorist networks, it's all designed to create a crisis that only he can solve. He's staging a coup? He's staging his path to the presidency. Once he eliminates the witnesses to his war crimes and establishes himself as the strong leader who defeated domestic terrorism, he'll be unstoppable. Maria looked around the room at the equipment that represented decades of her grandparents' work, at the people who had risked everything to honor Elena and Miguel's legacy. She thought about the families she had never met who were depending on warnings they didn't even know they needed. When do we start? Carmen's smile was both proud and heartbroken. Elena would be so proud of the woman you've become. As the sun set over the farmhouse, Maria Santos began her first official mission as a member of the resistance her grandmother had helped build. In 8 hours, she would either save hundreds of lives or die trying. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she was finally honoring the pendant she could no longer wear. The fight for her family's legacy was about to begin in earnest, and Maria was no longer afraid. She was ready to discover just how much strength her grandmother had passed down to her, hidden in stories that had seemed like simple family memories but were actually the keys to survival itself. The transmissions began at midnight. Maria sat at the central console, her grandmother's stories flowing from her memory into coded warnings that raced across radio waves to hidden receivers throughout the region. Each story became a lifeline, the tale of the baker's early morning routine translated to evacuation protocols for a safe house in the mountains. The memory of children playing in the plaza provided new contact codes for families hiding in the city. Carmen worked at a parallel station, coordinating with other resistance cells that had remained hidden from Morales' crackdown. The responses were immediate and heartbreaking. Families who had lived quietly for decades were packing their lives into single suitcases and disappearing into the night. Safe houses that had operated for 40 years were being abandoned within hours. Transmission from Cell 7, Carlos reported from his monitoring position. The Valdez family is secure. They received our warning with 6 hours to spare. Cell 12 confirms evacuation of the northern safe houses, Carmen added. 43 people relocated successfully. But the good news was tempered by darker reports. 3 families had been arrested before the warnings reached them. 2 safe houses had been raided while evacuations were still in progress. Morales' forces were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. He's using military-grade tracking equipment, Carlos said grimly, studying readings on his equipment. They're triangulating our signal, but they're also intercepting some of our transmissions. At 3 in the morning, the first helicopter appeared on the horizon. Maria could see its searchlight sweeping across the farmland, growing steadily closer to their position. How much time do we need? Carmen asked, her fingers never pausing on the keyboard. Maria consulted the list they had compiled from her grandmother's stories. 14 more families. Maybe 2 hours. We don't have 2 hours, Carlos said, watching the helicopters approach. Carmen made the decision that would define everything that followed. Maria, you need to leave. Now. Carlos can drive you to the backup extraction point while I finish the transmissions. I'm not abandoning you. This isn't about abandonment. It's about completing the mission. If Morales captures you, he gets access to everything your grandmother taught you. Every story, every code, every piece of information about the network. You can't let that happen. The helicopter was close enough now that they could hear its rotors cutting through the night air. Soon there would be vehicles on the ground, soldiers surrounding the farmhouse, and no way out. There's another option, Carlos said quietly. Both women turned to look at him. He was holding a small device that looked like a garage door opener. Elena designed this place with a final failsafe. If the resistance was ever completely compromised, the command center was supposed to be destroyed to prevent capture of the network's information. Maria understood immediately. You're talking about blowing up the building. I'm talking about protecting 40 years of your grandparents' work. If Morales gets his hands on this equipment, these records, he'll be able to track down everyone the resistance ever helped. Carmen stopped typing and looked around the room that had been her second home for over a decade. How long would it take for everyone to get clear? The device has a 15-minute delay. Enough time for Maria to reach the extraction point, not enough time for Morales' forces to breach the facility and recover the intelligence. The decision hung in the air like a physical presence. Destroy everything Elena and Miguel had built to prevent it from being turned against the people they had died to protect, or try to save the facility and risk losing everything anyway. Maria closed her eyes and heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Elena was standing beside her. Sometimes, child, the greatest victory comes from making sure your enemy cannot win. Do it, she said. Carlos nodded and activated the device. A small red light began blinking steadily, marking the countdown to destruction. But Carmen wasn't finished. Her hands flew over the keyboard with desperate efficiency. I'm uploading everything to the backup servers. If we can't save the physical facility, at least we can preserve the information. How long? 8 minutes. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its spotlight illuminating the farmhouse like day. Through the windows, Maria could see vehicle headlights approaching from multiple directions. They were surrounded. They're going to breach the building before the upload finishes, Carlos said, monitoring external communications. Carmen's face was set in determination. Then, I stay until it's done. Carmen Elena died to protect this network. I'm not going to let it be destroyed because I was too cowardly to see the mission through. The sound of boots on the farmhouse's front porch made the decision for all of them. Maria grabbed the small bag containing her grandmother's notebooks and the copies of the decoded information. Carlos led her to a hidden tunnel that connected to the farmhouse's root cellar. This leads to the old irrigation system, he whispered. Follow it east for half a mile, then surface near the creek. There's a motorcycle hidden in the abandoned barn. What about you? Someone needs to make sure Carmen completes the upload. Through the tunnel entrance, Maria could hear soldiers entering the farmhouse above. Shouted commands, the sound of doors being kicked in, Carmen's voice raised in defiance as she refused to step away from the computer terminal. The tunnel was narrow and dark, carved from earth and rock by men who had understood that freedom sometimes required crawling through the mud. Maria thought about her grandfather Miguel as she made her way through the passage he had helped dig, understanding for the first time the physical courage that resistance required. Behind her, she could hear muffled explosions as soldiers used breaching charges to enter the underground command center. Carmen's voice, still audible, counting down the seconds until the upload would be complete. Maria reached the creek just as the farmhouse exploded. The blast lit up the night sky, sending a pillar of fire and smoke into the darkness. Maria felt the shock wave through the ground beneath her feet, followed by the sound of secondary explosions as ammunition and fuel stores ignited. The motorcycle started on the first try, its engine purring with the reliability of equipment maintained by people whose lives depended on it. As Maria rode away from the burning remains of the command center, she carried with her the weight of everything Carmen and Carlos had sacrificed to complete their mission. Over the next week, the extent of their success became clear. Reports trickled in through hidden communication channels, families safely relocated, safe houses successfully evacuated, network members who had disappeared into new lives with new identities. The resistance had lost its central command facility, but its people were alive. Morales' political ambitions, however, had been destroyed. The explosion had been too visible, too dramatic to cover up. International media coverage of the crackdown against domestic terrorists had revealed the systematic nature of his campaign against resistance survivors. Questions were being asked about the original civil conflict, about civilian casualties, about war crimes that had been buried for 40 years. 2 months later, Maria stood in a small cemetery outside a city she could not name, in a country where her new identity papers said she had been born. The gravestone was simple, marking the resting place of a woman whose official biography listed her as a shopkeeper and mother. But Maria knew the truth. Elena Santos had been a warrior, a codemaker, a guardian of stories that could save lives or destroy them depending on who possessed them. She had passed that responsibility to her granddaughter in fragments and whispers, trusting that when the time came, Maria would find the strength to honor it. The pendant was gone, taken as evidence in an investigation that would never reach trial. But the symbols carved into its surface lived on in Maria's memory, along with all the stories her grandmother had used to encode them. She was the keeper of those stories now, the guardian of a network that spanned generations and continents. As she walked away from the cemetery, Maria felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Somewhere in the world, there were people who needed protection, families who required safe passage, stories that needed to be preserved and passed on. Elena Santos had raised her granddaughter to be ready for this responsibility. Now it was Maria's turn to ensure the next generation would be prepared to carry the torch when their time came. The resistance had lost its symbol, but its spirit lived on in the woman who had learned to read her family's secrets in bedtime stories and children's games. Maria Santos walked into her new life carrying everything that mattered from her old one, the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they had the courage to try, and the understanding that some legacies were worth any sacrifice to preserve. In the distance, church bells were ringing, their sound carrying across the hills like a message of hope. Maria smiled, remembering her grandmother's words about strength coming from unexpected places. She had finally discovered what Elena had always known, that the most powerful symbol of resistance wasn't a pendant worn around the neck, but the willingness to protect others even when the cost was everything you thought you knew about yourself. The mission was complete, but the work would never end. And Maria Santos, keeper of stories and guardian of hope, was finally ready to embrace the destiny her grandmother had spent a lifetime preparing her for.